Good afternoon. Time now a few minutes after 5 o'clock in the late afternoon in Tokyo, Friday, July the 30th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group online seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize many online seminars introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. Today, we are having a special session starting at 5 p.m. In Tokyo because our speaker is joining us from Spain. At this seminar, we are featuring a new report titled Public-Private Partnership in Urban Bus System, an analytical framework for project identification and preparation. This was published on June the 9th. With us connecting from Spain, we have the pleasure of having Alejandro Hoyos Guerrero, the Senior Transport Specialist of the Transport Global Practice and the author of the Public-Private Partnership in Urban Bus System report. Alejandro, how are you? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Koichi, for the introduction. Everything seems to work well.
Great, thank you. Alejandro came to Tokyo and presented a case of the transport-oriented development project in Ecuador at our seminar in January 2020, one of the last face-to-face seminars we organized in Tokyo before the pandemic. We'll listen to Alejandro presenting the main point of the report firstly. Following his presentation, as usual, I'll read your question. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so. Even during this seminar using online form posted on the announcement page for the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section on the YouTube screen. After Alejandro's presentation, I'll read your question and ask him to respond. With that, I'd like to ask Alejandro formally to come in to start your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Koichi, and thank you for accommodating the time. I'm working from Spain. I used to work in Washington, D.C. time, but this time with Japan, it was like very difficult to me with two babies to connect at 3 a.m. local time. So I really appreciate the flexibility, and I am very happy to be able to share the report content with you and the audience. And I do encourage people to please send questions during the presentation, because this is usually the most interesting part of any presentation. I will share the PowerPoint, and please, Koichi, let me know if this is properly set. 1 second, I have to swap the screens.
Yes, perfect.
This is it. Thank you. So my name is Alejandro Hoyos, and I'm an urban transport specialist at the World Bank. I've been working at the bank for 8 years, mostly in urban transport projects, and I have a lot of exposure with the bus financing. And this book I wrote with Abel Lopez, a specialist in Mexico, and many other colleagues. It's a recollection of many of our experiences. And I would like to start giving you some context of the motivation to write the book and the reason we wrote it. Also clarifying the scope, what's included, what's not, and then we will walk you through the book structure, giving you like a preliminary view of what's in the book and the main messages. Mainly the before embarking of a PPP for the identification stage, and then we will go to the preparation stage of a PPP project cycle in urban buses, the risk matrix, and some elements for defining the project structure, and we'll close with some preliminary conclusions before entering the questions and answer phase. So on the introduction, I want to point out that probably BRTs, Bus Rapid Transit, is the most common project for structuring PPPs. And Latin America is the cradle of BRT. It's all started in Curitiba in Brazil in the 60s, but the paramount of the structuring a BRT project, I would say, is Transmilenio in the beginning of the millennia. This was successfully replicated in Mexico and Brazil, and then moved to the rest of the world and to the rest of the region, duplicating in many cities. You can see the data on BRT in the world, and you can see that the Latin America, as it was the beginning and the early adopter, is prevalent on passengers riding BRTs, in length of BRTs, and number of cities that have a BRT. But the BRT technology is present in all 5 continents with a relatively strong presence, maybe except for Africa. And as I was telling you, this all started with the millennium, with the inauguration of Transmilenio in Bogota, which was very inspiring because it was very successful. And at some point, we got this very appealing narrative. We were told that this kind of reform was taking transport from chaos and disorganization and pollution and noise and ugliness to order and beauty and big fancy new vehicles, clean and ready to service the users. And we had also a proven successful recipe. We needed infrastructure for the exclusive lanes. We needed routes and fleet rationalization because with bigger buses, we could move the same people with less vehicles and less drivers, so it was cheaper. We will need a rationalization of the services and a reorganization of the operators, creating a new public operator, usually under an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, that will be the operator of the service. We will need new rolling stock. Let's dump all these old ugly buses and let's buy new big buses. And we will need technological components, fleet management systems and electronic fare collection systems to make the service easier for the user and to make monitoring of the services better. And this was kind of the main image, the main message that we all received. And this was what was tried to replicate, almost like if it was a cookie cutter in every project. It got replicated successfully in Mexico in line 1, and with the same idea, transforming all these microbuses, the small buses that were chaotic in Mexico, into a mass transit BRT corridors. And then the concept went beyond BRT corridors and got also into making smaller city systems or traditional systems more efficient by rationalizing fleets, even without the exclusive lane. So this was successfully applied in Bogota, Mexico City, and it was also not only replicated worldwide in many cities, but also embedded in the regulation in countries like Mexico and Colombia. In Mexico and Colombia, they have national urban transport programs providing resources for covering the infrastructure. And what could possibly go wrong with this, right? So I will let you know a little bit about the program in Mexico and Bogota because I had the opportunity to work at first in Mexico. And what I found about these programs is that they were hugely transformative. They were able to incentivize sector reforms in sectors that were really, really tough to move. And for decades, they had been the same conventional structures and were kind of broken. But then the program in Mexico, it has some requirements. The first one, as in Colombia, it was focused on infrastructure. The national government was paying for infrastructure. So any reform that did not include infrastructure will not be fostered, will not be incentivized. Then it required business reorganization. It required an SPV. It required that the traditional operators were transformed into an SPV. And also it required private sector participation. You needed CapEx. And if you didn't have enough CapEx in the technological components, and you needed private sector participation in the provision of buses. And if it was not enough, then in the provision of infrastructure. So these kind of requirements were kind of shaping the technical solution that was applied to the city. And what happened? Well, the first thing that happened is that I got to know Mexico very well because we had a project in which we could potentially support any city participating in the program. And as you can imagine, free infrastructure money was something very appealing for the governments. So we were running behind many cities in Mexico to understand how could we support them. And we usually at the bank support the public investment in infrastructure or rolling stock. But in this project, we could also finance indirectly through a local financing entity, Banobras, the rolling stock for the private operators. And for that, we needed to finance a PPP. So this was not happening, and we wanted to understand why. So we started asking every single financier, every bank, and understanding how were the bus financing in Mexico was something shocking because we realized most of the projects were not bankable. When we talk about bankability, we talk about the ability of a project to receive a loan from a bank, which is having a combination of risk and benefit that is appealing for the private sector. What happened with this project was that they were too small in scale for the banks to really make an effort to understand them and too complex. And we will go into that later. But the governance structures of the operators were not professional in all cases, and the complexity of the project make it really, really difficult for assessing. So the bus operators were having financing either from local banks that were boutique banks specialized in the sector. And one funny anecdote is that the operators in Lyon, they were partially owning a bank, and this was the bank providing loans for them, or more usually through the bus manufacturer. If you are selling buses in Mexico, Mexico's operators usually won't have access to finance. So the only way you can sell a bus is to provide the financing for the bus, which is not very efficient. And of course, the financing conditions were really, really expensive. So after all the analysis for Mexico, we came with the solution, we thought, for what can we do to achieve project finance, to get financing to the SPV, to get financing to the project, because I have mentioned the most important part. All these loans were not going to the project, to an SPV. All these loans were going on the books of big operators that had record of financing, and they were not linked formally to the project. This was not project finance, it was conventional lending. So we came up with several elements that were needed for achieving project financing, having the possibility of using the concession as a guarantee, having a solvent regulator, a public entity, banning informal competition that was killing demand, and I will go to that later. Having a trust fund guarantee, having the fair revenue collected in a trust fund and guaranteeing the payments for the bank for the loans, having economic equilibrium clauses guaranteeing that if demand was not enough, then the operators will be properly compensated, avoiding cash to avoid the risk of managing cash, and then having a tariff policy that was predictable. And this was the most difficult part because any politician in Mexico, they want votes, and increasing the tariff is not good for that. And it's not also good for achieving social objectives and keeping affordability. So the contingency plan we had is if the government decides not to update the tariff policy, then they should have issued a partial guarantee. So if there is a revenue issue, the partial guarantee will be activated and will cover the loans loss. This was not successful. This scheme was used successfully not by us but by the Mexico City government for some corridors, but was not widely adopted. And then we also work in Colombia with a very similar program. The government was financing infrastructure up to 70% with non-reimbursable resources. And they were also requiring business reorganization, something that also resonated a lot with me. That they were in the law, the objective of the law for improving mobility was rationalizing the fleet. So this was not a means to achieve something, it was a policy objective, rationalizing fleet, reducing the service, which is kind of counterintuitive. And they were requiring by law electronic fare collection. So again, the requirements from this program was like kind of fostering the implementation of mini Transmilenios all over Colombia. 2000 Transmilenio arrived to Bogota. 6 years later, we had a similar project in Pereira. Then in 2009, we had Cali. In 2010, Bucaramanga, and then Metroplus in Medellin 1 year later, and finally Cartagena in 2015. After 2018, there were some attempts in replicating the system in smaller cities with no exclusive lane, and this was not very successful. And what we found in Colombia was even more worrying than what we found in Mexico. In terms of financing, the situation was exactly the same. All the financiers were also very scared about the sector because they had very bad experiences in the past, and projects were in general not bankable. But we also found that when a reform like Transmilenio was implemented in many cities, what happened was a vicious circle. In this graph, you can see what happened in Bucaramanga. The vertical lines are the level of services. You can see that when the BRT starts, and this is the small red lines, the level of service decrease in total. And the other lines are the total demand. In green, the demand on the traditional system, and in purple, the demand on the BRT system. And what we found in Bucaramanga was that the total level of demand of the whole city of public transport was decreasing. And what was even more worrying, this table is showing you the evolution of transport demand in Colombian cities. Except for Bogota and Medellin, most of the cities were experiencing a reduction in public transport use of 30%. We carried some analysis and some studies with international consultants. One of them gathered the data and published this paper here, and he found that the reforms were associated with a decrease in aggregated transit ridership. So what are we trying to achieve with this project? We're usually trying to achieve an improvement in mobility and fostering public transport as the most sustainable way of moving in the cities. But what was happening was exactly the opposite. In many cities, we were killing transport demand. Why were Transmilenio, Mexico successful? Because this specific project had the right local conditions for introducing a BRT under a PPP scheme. They had very long trips in the exclusive corridors that were generating travel time savings that were worth it for the rest of the investment and were attracting users. These were systems that were more appealing to users than the other alternatives, but it didn't happen in all the cities. So at some point, we lose perspective, and at some point we started trying to replicate, and this is our argument in the beginning of the book. We started to trying to replicate Transmilenio. Instead of trying to improve mobility, we had this cookie-cutter approach in which we needed exclusive lane, electronic fare collection, and SPV for the operation, and just replicate what worked in Bogota. And we lose sight of the real objective of the project, which in most cases should be improving mobility. And this is why we wrote this book after many previous works. And the book, I will say, it's a trap, because the title of the book is Public-Private Partnership in Urban Bus System. Come and we will help you prepare better structures. But the reality is that the first section of the book, is precisely targeting the problem I have just explained. The PPP-like approaches are overused and influence project definition. So what we are doing in the first section of the book is trying to first make an intentional argument for setting the right objectives and taking into account stakeholders, then show potential alternatives for a PPP-like approach or for a BRT approach. And finally, setting what are the feasibility, the minimum requirements for having a PPP. But even if the PPP is the best alternative, which sometimes happen, you cannot make a PPP because you don't comply with that. Once you have finished the first part, then you know whether or not your project is a candidate for a PPP, then you start preparing a PPP. But our intention with the book is trying to avoid most of the planners jumping into the idea of having a BRT of a PPP and considering alternatives. So this is basically repeating that I just said before, and what are the sections of the book doing. And another thing that we are doing with the book is that we are avoiding providing recipes for success. We are trying to imagine the book as a big table with a lot of elements for every process of the project cycle. We are providing what are the most common alternatives, what are the things to think about. We are trying to be very comprehensive in identifying risks, in identifying elements, but we are trying to avoid providing a specific advice, because it depends on the context. What we do provide is a lot of reference. You will find a lot of reference to different books, different guides, different tools. Everything that we could find, we put it and easy to find in the book. So the idea is that this book can be used as a reference guide, and when you have a specific question or problem in a specific issue, then you can go to the book, you will find a brief description, and you will find reference to follow suit your research. Now, in terms of the PPP project cycle, we usually identify 4 different phases: planning and identification, in which we discuss technical alternatives and we discuss the feasibility of a PPP. Then preparation. Once the PPP is deemed appropriate, then you refine the scope, the technical scope of the project. You conduct the legal, technical, and economic feasibility of the project. Then you do a proper value for money analysis to assess the PPP feasibility and define the implementation plan. These are the 2 stages in which the analytic framework, this book, is useful. This book is not useful for carrying out the structuring, which is drafting the contract, confirming the financial instruments, conducting the bidding process, etc. And it's not also useful for implementation and management. It's not addressing those parts. And now let's start also by defining what a public-private partnership is, which is usually defined as a long-term contract, something long-term between a private party and a government entity, a private and a public entity, for providing a public asset of service. This should be the object of the contract, and this is probably the most defining part, in which the private party bears significant risk and management responsibility. And remuneration is linked to performance. Remuneration being linked to performance is part of the private party bearing risk. What is not a PPP? And this is a common mistake. A PPP is not a financing mechanism. You are not using a PPP for getting financing. A PPP is not an instrument to create fiscal space. It will not. The cash flow of the municipality or the public entity may differ without a PPP, but it's not magically creating fiscal space. If you don't have the money for the project, a PPP won't create it for you. And the PPP is not an instrument to foster sectoral reorganization. If you want your operators to perform better, to be better organized, you don't need to pull them into a special purpose vehicle at all. Now, what is a PPP useful for? First, it's useful for transferring upfront cost to the private sector. This doesn't mean that if you don't have the money to pay, then you go to the private sector, because the private sector won't trust you as a partner if you are not solvent, if you don't have borrowing capacity, if you cannot pay a loan or a debt for the same length of the PPP, he won't trust that you will be able to cover their losses. Then it's useful for improving efficiency at project design, implementation, or operation, but by having the ability and the skills of the private parties. And it's also useful for achieving a more efficient risk allocation. And this is the core of the PPP concept, giving or allocating risks and functions under the party that is very suited for managing them. And in terms of scope, when we are thinking about operation of public transport, we can go for full public operation to simply unregulated private agents providing services on their own with no regulation. A PPP, it's defined by the level of risk that is transferred. A typical PPP will be a concession for fleet provision and or operation, and you can also consider a service provision contract with a lot of risk transferred to the private sector, kind of a PPP. Now, the analytical framework covers a bit of a wider scope of a PPP. It can be useful for structuring service provision contract with almost no transfer of risk, but it is using a risk matrix and a risk allocation for the strategy of structuring this contract. It will simply, the risk matrix will be allocating most of the risk in the public sector. And now we start with the usefulness of the book, of the tool on the identification stage. This part of the presentation will go to the planning identification stage. And the first thing the book is trying to address is what I mentioned before. We need to start by understanding what are the objectives of the project, and we need to identify the different stakeholders before structuring a project. And from my perspective, this analysis is essential for having success in the project and should not be done only at the beginning. We should have in mind the different stakeholders' objectives and their restrictions through all the stages of the project, and trying to remind, is this change affecting any stakeholders, how this will be like impacting the project. There are some objectives that are common for all parties. Reduce generalized cost of transport benefits everybody. Reduce emissions benefits everybody. Reducing congestion or improving road safety benefits everybody. But there are other objectives that are a trade-off. Increasing the quality of service may be a trade-off with affordability or with fiscal austerity, if you need to increase the fares for achieving that, or if you need to put subsidies. Then you, on one hand, may want to achieve more competition in the market, but on the other hand, you want to include incumbent operators in the structure. And then the banks will be like looking at their loan repayment, while the users will prefer having a cheaper fare and the government not having to subsidize the project through the risking mechanisms. So those objectives, this is the key in which the fine-tuning of the structure should allocate and try to manage all these objective settings. these are some examples. I'm seeing that I'm going quite slow, so maybe you can go through these examples in the book or in the presentation of objectives and restrictions of main stakeholders in the project. But we are distinguishing three categories of stakeholders: community members, which are public transport users, also public transportation users, and then residents and businesses that are affected by the project construction or by the project implementation. Then public entities at the different levels: national, subnational, the major and public financial entities, and even development agencies and multilateral banks. And finally, private entities: incumbent operators, other operators that operate other modes of transport, potential bidders or suppliers for the project, and potential investors and financiers. This is trying to help, again, trying not to say what are the objectives, because it will depend on the context, what are the strength of every stakeholders, what is the interest, but it is trying to foster like a keeping an open mind and trying to analyze the context, trying not to replicate anything that work anywhere else. And this will be the first step. The second step that we are inviting planners to take before embarking on a PPP is having these objectives in mind, looking for the best solution, the best alternative, the best delivery method to achieve these objectives. And again, we are not trying to provide any solution, just trying to foster open-minded seeking of solution. We have identified three main categories for these kind of solutions or delivery methods that we are seeing are working all over the world without a PPP. And the first one, and with or without, because this can be combined in some cases with a PPP. The first one is technology enablers. And technology can improve user experience and reduce travel time. If you are informing people when their bus is arriving, then they can plan better and reduce waiting times in the stations. Technology can also improve the operator's capacity and improve their operation by providing them information about the fleet, helping with fleet management, and helping even them identify which are the worst drivers by allowing users to rate them. And of course, technology can improve institutional capacity for planning. When they have data about operations, they can improve planning, and also monitoring. When they have vehicle location information, they can monitor that the service agreement are being complied with, the speeds are being complied with, the schedules, the stops, etc. Then in terms of infrastructure, sometimes we think of BRT as I explained in the beginning, the full animal with all the toys and the station, the exclusive lane, the SPV. But what really made Transmilenio work, the main thing that makes Transmilenio work, is the increased speed because of the exclusive lane. So what they did in La Matanza in Buenos Aires was providing an exclusive lane without having an SPV, simply having the operators that already exist using the exclusive lane to increase their operating speed. And it works, and you only need that. And there are many other alternatives that the city can implement without even investing in huge infrastructure like that. They can dedicate a street exclusively for public transport during peak hours, and this has been done in many cities, like Temuco in Chile. They have some cameras that they identify like the plaques of the private vehicles that are not complying with this during the peak hours to issue fines, and it's working good. Or the typical shared lines like we find in many European and American cities. It's just during the peak hours there is a preference line for bus and taxi, and this complied with it. It's only paint. It's not so expensive, and you're increasing speeds. And finally, considering legal alternatives. When I said PPPs are not like a method for fostering like a sectoral reforms, they are not. If you want your operators to behave in a particular manner, if you want them to plan collectively, there are ways to do that. And the usual alternative is having permits or licenses instead of a concession, and it's what we have in most of the cities. And these are powerful elements because they are subject to requirements. So I may go through that later in more detail, but a very good example of all these alternatives together is the city Medellin in Colombia. They went through a traditional, they have a metro, they have a BRT which is publicly operated, and then they have traditional bus routes, which are divided into areas. All these 2, 8, 3, 6 numbers that you see there, they are the different cuencas, they say, they are areas. So they started by trying to reform the traditional buses using the khaki cutter approach. And they conducted a bidding process for Cuencas 3 and 6. And then they end up with a very successful bidder, which is costing them, I don't remember exactly the figure, but maybe $20 million a year in subsidies. And they also had a lot of problems because at the beginning, the bidder has no depots. And of course, the incumbent operators were not very happy to lend their depots. So what they did after was having a successful bid or the threat of doing that, they convinced operators in Cuencas 4 and 5 and 2 and 8 to enter into what they call business collaboration agreements. They keep their licenses, but then they enter into an agreement among themselves with an agreed common operational plan, with incorporating the fair collection of the integrated system, with an agreement on fleet renovation, and an agreement on rationalization which is actually adapted to the needs. And the final outcome of this is that while in Cuencas 3 and 6, the city has to pay a huge subsidies. In the rest of the Cuencas, especially 4 and 5, the service has improved significantly, the fleet is renewed, and subsidy is zero because this has turned out to be self-sustainable. Of course, this is not the panacea. Many things can improve in Medellin, but this is showing us something that the legal alternatives are possible. Now, the final part of this first part of the book is assessing the feasibility of a PPP. Maybe the city has the right conditions, the technical alternative is the best, and it's obvious that we should go ahead. But sometimes we should, but we cannot. And there are three elements or areas for assessing feasibility. And in the book, we provide some guiding questions for answering and finding whether or not a PPP will be feasible. The first one is technical elements. Is the solution benefiting public transport users? Why do we ask this? Because if it is not, then public transport users will probably find a way to use other alternative, and your demand estimations will be grossly overestimated, and you won't have the revenue, and your financial sustainability will fall. And the other one is, does the solution contribute to integration of the overall transport system? Because what we have seen is that isolated projects in the center of the city are usually failing. The second and most important element is, can you afford it? Because projects are rarely, very rarely self-sustainable. We have very, very, very few examples in the world of self-sustainable urban transport projects, even based in buses. Now, the alternative source of funding that we usually discuss and we discuss in the book, they are not the panacea either. They are not unlimited, and we have to know whether or not the city can commit the budget for the project. And finally, whether or not there are institutional and regulatory elements. Legal framework for PPPs is the obvious. In Ecuador, for instance, they have two parallel systems for PPP, one that is undefined and the other one that is providing fiscal incentives without even defining a project cycle. There is no a legal certainty yet. The government is working on reforms, but the PPP in that country is really, really unfeasible because of a lack of a strong legal framework. And then having an authority with adequate capacity, having a counterpart. You in a public-private partnership, you need an agency, you need an authority to manage a contract and to enforce and monitor the compliance. If you don't have that, then well, the private party will be very happy to enter into a PPP with you, but the city, the citizens, the users, and everybody else will not be very happy with the results. And this is where all comes together. If your alternative serve the objectives of the reform, mainly improve mobility, if a PPP is the best alternative for delivery method, and if you can afford it and you have the right conditions, then go ahead. Otherwise, go with an alternative. No, don't be stubborn and pursue a PPP or a project that will be a failure in the future. Now, If all these happen, then we go with the second part of the book. For me, the most important part of the book is the first one, because it is addressing the problem that we have seen. 80% of the projects were not feasible and they were carried out anyways. And the second part of the book, the core of this is focused on the preparation part, where we assign risks and functions to different parties and decide which will be the project components. And the core of this section and the core of the analytical framework as well, and where the most comprehensive work we have done is in the risk matrix. And this is at the core of structuring PPPs. First, you have to identify and analyze the risks and their potential impacts, then allocate the risks and responsibilities to parties, and devise mitigation strategies. And when full mitigation is not possible, how to insurance this risk. And for that, again, we are not providing specific solutions or specific messages applied to any project. What we try to provide is a quite comprehensive, but not complete, because every context will have something different, list of risks. We try to provide definitions of every risk, and then we also provide some mitigation or reallocation strategies complemented with the examples from project. The framework has an appendix of 12 projects that are analyzed in terms of pros and cons, and elements of these projects are used to define the different risks. So what is a risk? A risk is something that we don't know whether or not will happen, but if it happens, it will have a negative impact on a key project objective. Sometimes when I see a risk identification exercise, I see that planners point out as risks, which are actually the manifestation of the risk, like having less revenue than expected. Well, this is something that happens because a risk has occurred, but you have to identify the risk that is causing this less revenue than expected. It's not that they having less revenue than expected. How do I mitigate that? Okay, so it's important to have this mindset in identifying risk, and then allocating risk to the party best suited to manage it. What does it mean? Which is that party? It's the party that is in a best position to predict the risk occurrence, the party that is able to lower the impact or the probability of the risk occurrence, and then the party that is less vulnerable to the risk occurrence or more resilient to it. Now, risk can be categorized depending on what originates a risk or on what is the risk impacting. What we have done is that we have linked project functions with project risks. A bit faster. Yes, Koichi. Yes, we are really. So I will jump through this. You will find in the books that for every category of risk, we have identified quite a lot of risks, and we are defining them, and we are explaining how to mitigate them in different contexts. This is an example. You can see risk category, explanation, examples of good practice in the box of international experiences, and then references. A lot of references so you can analyze the risk. 3 risks that merit special attention, and maybe we can cover that if you are interested in the questions and answer. First one is dealing with incumbent operators, and I will give 2 points for dealing with them, and maybe one. You need to take advantage of their assets. Incumbent operators have physical assets that are very important for projects, depots, buses, and we should take advantage of that. And they have also intangible assets. They have political power, they have knowledge about the operation, and we should take advantage of that while keeping our people happy, and also not taking advantage in a bad way of incumbent operators. Managing demand risk at the design stage. This is one of the most common mistakes that we have seen in all projects. When you see the planned demand, 400,000 passengers, actual demand, 20,000 passengers. Why is the project not financially sustainable? Because it has no passengers, because it has no revenue. Why is happening? First, because we are having mistakes in the estimation of the user choices and preferences. We think that we are moving boxes, and boxes don't make decisions. They will just go in the bus because they think they are faster and they are told to. But people have alternatives, and they have more and more alternatives every time. We are ignoring gender. We are ignoring that the women have special needs that need to be attended. We are subestimating the waiting times that are usually 3 times penalized and in comparison to in-vehicle times. We are subestimating the ability of people of walking. People don't like to walk and people don't like to transfer. Many times, oftentimes people prefer to stay more time in one conventional bus from door to door than having to transfer 1 or 2 times and enter into a mass system and be uncomfortable and not sitting. And we ignore the local context. I remember some planners using some data or some parameters from Bogota in Sincelejo, which is a city with 40 Celsius degrees in the shadow. So they were expecting people to wait for 5 minutes under the sun of Sincelejo when they have the alternative of running into a moto taxi, an informal moto that will take them immediately to the destination. And then something that I see a lot is that we design a project, then we don't have enough money, or we want to make up the financial model, then we reduce frequencies, reduce the production. It's cheaper, right? But then reducing the frequencies, you will have an impact on demand. People will have more waiting time. People will prefer alternatives. Nobody corrects the demand. Nobody reruns the model. So we are surprised when providing half of the buses and having half of the demand. And this is an example in Acapulco. We were running a feeder that was cheaper than a perrera, a dog cage, they call this kind of vehicles. But all the kids were in the perrera. And I asked myself, why? Are they more comfortable? And the perrera has more frequencies. Are they more safe? Probably not. Is it the temperature they have in the breeze in the air? Or is it just fun? Or is it that the perrera will take them from door to door? We need to ask them, and for that we have preferences, stated and revealed preference surveys that will help us better understand the user preference and better estimate their time values. And finally, defining technology components. It's also something that merits special attention when defining risk. And this is basically the risk matrix. And I will jump to the conclusions going very fast to the defining the project structure. Because in the book, while we are not helping the structuring and procurement, we are considering special some elements. Because at the end of the preparation, you should have the business model. This is the reason I was saying vast projects are more complex than other projects. Renewable energy project, energy plan. We have an SPV. The SPV is the plan, and that's all. In urban bus, you have the infrastructure, the signaling, the terminals, the depots, the rolling stock, the fare collection system. And for all of them, you have the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And the combination of different responsibilities are endless. So combining them right is something not as easy or not as obvious than in other projects. And we are providing in the book like a base structure, which is the most common structure. Infrastructure will be public. The operators, even if they don't have access to finance, will be providing the buses and operating them. And there will be an additional operator for providing and operating the fare collection system. And then we are discussing different alternatives, like unbundling the fleet provision and operation, which has some pros and some cons that we can discuss in the question and answer if interested. We have also the alternative of private provision of infrastructure, which also have pros and cons. And also we have made the special consideration for e-buses and the pros and cons that we don't have time to cover. I'm sorry, but we can go through it in the questions and answer if interested. Of course, these are just examples because the objective of the risk matrix is that the users achieve this structure by allocating responsibilities and risks. And finally, how the book ends, if with a review of potential financial instruments. We have to make a difference between funding and financing. Funding will be getting revenue, and financing will be using future revenue now, bringing future resources to the present. And for funding, I highly recommend this other book, Sustainable Urban Transport Financing from the Sidewalk to the Subway by Arturo Ardila, because it is a really comprehensive analysis of potential funding mechanisms, how difficult are they to implement, and how good are they in impacting behavior. Setting up subsidies, supply and demand subsidies is also discussed. And the final chapter of the book is discussing essential elements of a contract. concession contract for the operation, which is the most common contract, technical, economic, and institutional and regulatory elements. So I will run through main messages and make time for the question and answer. PPP is not a goal, it's just a delivery method. Forget about PPP. Urban bus projects are complex, and this complexity needs to be addressed together with the local solutions. There is not one size fits all. We need to analyze every single decision we make and understand why we are making it. And the answer cannot be because it works in another city. Then there are common issues in urban bus PPPs. We are not estimating demands properly. The risk allocation, I have seen 2 different risk matrix for 2 different projects. And they were exactly the same because it was the same consultant. Just one was electric buses and the other one not. And in one cell in the Excel, they had, we have to take into account the possibility of electric prices increasing. That was the only difference. It's just, they are not taking that seriously. Then demand overestimation and lack of appropriate integration and articulation at urban level. And incumbent operators, it's critical for success, understanding and properly dealing with them. And it's key that we incorporate the tangible and intangible assets. So thank you. Sorry for taking too much time at the beginning, and hopefully this was somewhat useful, and I'm eager to have the question and answer. I don't want to take up much more time.
Thank you, Alejandro, for your presentation. I'm sorry I pushed you a little bit going first, as we received actually many interesting questions. I have 9 or 10 questions that we received. So probably I'll read 3 questions in each round and ask you to respond. The first set of questions that we received from the viewers in advance. First one, a question from Mori-san. How do you think of the roles of new technologies? Introducing new technologies may be challenging in some situations and would require additional financial resources, but new technologies may offer an opportunity to reconstruct the entire structure of the society or people's behavior. Would we consider of new technologies always be introduced in building a new PPP structure? That's the first question. And the next 2 questions are from Sasamori-san. Thank you very much. When introducing sector reform to a situation where incumbent operators are already operating, a very difficult process is expected due to political pressure from the incumbent operators. In the precedent cases, what kind of dialogue process and encouragement specifically realized the sector reform? And the third question from the Sasamori-san, most of this report analyzes the financial and structural issues based on concessional structure. But if there are incumbent operators, it would be a more realistic option that is to introduce a licensing structure in which licensed operators are regulated. In this case, I think the regulation and its enforcement, monitoring for execution will be important factors to consider for planners. What kind of regulation and monitoring are specifically introduced in the success cases of licensing? So these are the first set of 3 questions, and Alejandro, I'll ask you to respond. Thank you. You are muted.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you for the questions, and I am quite impressed because they are. I really think that they are hitting the key issues that I consider for this kind of projects. Now, on the role of new technologies, is it will be considered new technologies always to be introduced in building a new PPP structure? I will always say no to always. I mean, we have to be open and we have to consider the pros and cons of new technologies. Now, what do I think is the role of new technologies? Fundamental, critical. The opportunities are huge. So new technologies can help us improve the user experience by providing them information about the system, by providing them easy fare collection system. They can also help the operators, but having the operators improve their fleet management and the operational capacity. And it can also be useful for the authority by helping them planning and also monitoring services. One thing about new technologies is that it doesn't have to be all top down. I have seen in many cities spend millions of dollars in buying a GPS for every vehicle in the system, while in others, they realize that most of the vehicles already have a GPS, so they enter into an agreement with the operators to provide this data. So try to leverage all the technologies that are already implemented by the private sector. Don't try from the public authority to implement an app for user information. Just open your data and provide an API so private developers can develop that. So this will be the second. The first thing is there is no recipe, there is no always. The second thing is a huge opportunity for many different aspects, and the third one is try to leverage the private sector developed technologies. Now, when the other question says when introducing a sector reform to a situation when incumbent operators are already operating, it is a very difficult process. It is a very difficult process. I will share my presentation, and because I ran through a slide in which I had like how this has been dealt with in general in the world, and the alternatives are many. Here it is. So we have seen in cities that the public authority has simply take over the operation and expel the buses. It was Quito, and they had to take the army to the streets. Then a slightly less strong approach is having non-competitive concession to a third party. In Mexico City, Metrobus Line 4, they simply picked a private operator and gave the concession to them. Then the most accepted practice is international competitive bidding, an open competitive process in which everybody is participating with equal conditions. Then a similar approach, but with a small preference for existing operators, that it happened in Transmilenio. Then doing the bidding process only if existing operators decline to participate. And this is what happened with the Medellin business agreements. In Cuencas 3 and 6, they told the operators, do you want to play the game of improving the system? They said no. So then the government opened a bidding process for these Cuencas 3 and 6. Then what they are doing in Mexico is formalizing the existing operators. Is the operators agreed on playing the game of improving system, and they go through formalization. Happen also in South Africa, etc. There is no perfect recipe. I've been saying that during all the evening. But I think we should keep a balance between these two factors. The first one is removing barriers for entry, foster competition. And I will give you an example. And the second one is taking advantage of the incumbent operators' tangible and intangible assets. In Medellin, I told you, the external operator that came, they had a lot of problem in finding depots, because depots are usually scarce in cities with density. What they did in Singapore is that they made the incumbent operators put the depots at the disposal of any bidder, and the depots will be leased by the government, so they will be paying the operators for them. This is a way of taking advantage of the assets of the operator while promoting competition and removing barriers to entry. But then we also need to understand the political power of many of the transport operators and their knowledge about the system, and that is mitigated by including them since the beginning in the planning stage, for two reasons. First, because you are including them, so they can participate and make sure that the interests are taken into account. Second, because they have usually a very deep knowledge about the reality of the operation in the city, so your planning process will be much more informed than if you were not including them. And for the last question, it was about the incumbent operators, how to include them under a licensing agreement. So I think I covered that during the presentation when I talk about the Medellin, but I will make reference to something that I did not make reference. Because Cuencas 4 and 5, I said, and the others, they enter into these business agreements for collaboration. These were agreements among private parties, among the operators that agree with the authority on a common operational plan, on certain targets for introducing the fare collection that is provided by the metro and paid by operators to the metro, on having a common branding with the city. But one of the most interesting things that the imaging they did, and it's necessary for entering into these kind of agreements, is the city created a platform for monitoring the operation of these buses. You cannot enter into a service provision agreement, agreeing on frequencies and agreement routes and schedules if you cannot monitor them. And usually it was very difficult to monitor that. But now, with automatic vehicle location data, you can do that. And in Medellin, they did not provide every single unit with a GPS. They created a platform able to gather all the information that the operators already had. So this was part of the agreement. Now the authority can monitor whether or not the operator are complying with the operating plans. They can sanction, penalize if they don't. And this is a way to also ensure that all the services are covered, because it is very typical that the operator will operate too much in more dense corridors and then underserve other areas, for instance. So in addition to this agreement between parties that was sanctioned by the government, the inclusion of technology made it possible to operate or to reform under license agreements. I think the three questions were very related, and I hope that this is answering them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. We received more questions, and let me read the other three questions. The first one from Shibuki-san. Thank you very much for your question. In terms of TOD, transit-oriented development, would you share us any risk or significant element for BRT? So that's the first question. Second one, question from Sano-san. Thank you for your question. I would like to know how the World Bank Group responds to PPP project in developing countries during the COVID-19. Transportation sector was harshly affected because of the decline in demand. As a result, it affects the special purpose vehicle, SPV's cash flow and management. Any comment, please? And the third one, we received several questions from Tsuboike-san. Let me read first one from your question list. This is related to the capacity of the BRT. BRT is a major public transport system in Latin America, but with the increase in urban population, I believe there are some cities that are capacity of BRT is not large enough to accommodate all demand. We see long queues or sometimes overcrowded at some bus stops. How do you see the future of BRT in these countries? Moving to the bigger mode of transport, such as metro, combination of both, or any other ideas? Do you think the PPP model for BRT is also applicable for metro? So these are the questions, and then I'll ask Alejandro to respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koichi, and I'm really enjoying the questions because they are like addressing very important topics. In terms of TOD, my main message on that will be that the risk of TOD is considering TOD as a land value capture method, or as a way to create a transaction or to make money for any other project. Because this is what we've been seeing, and it's something very similar to what I was talking about with the concession. Sometimes we focus so much on the transaction. When we think about TOD, we think about trying to sell building rights and trying to aggregate demand and trying to structure a transaction. And TOD is, from my point of view, is not about about structuring a transaction. It's about achieving a goal, which is making more sustainable, making cities more sustainable by reducing the need to travel, making cities more compact, in reducing also the travel times and the travel distances, increasing road safety. And in general, when you focus in many cities on delivering a transaction, then you may be losing the opportunity of structuring a better project that doesn't even have to be like a delivered as a transaction. Simply introducing a public investment to foster appropriate uses can be more beneficial. So this is the main problem I'm seeing with the TOD projects. Now, on the second, how the World Bank Group responds to PPP during COVID-19, I think right now it will be very difficult to it may be very difficult, or might have been very difficult, to have a successful PPP COVID-19 project. We a successful PPP during the COVID-19, and we've been monitoring very closely what's happening in most of the countries with the demand. At the peak, it was reduced by 90%, 80%, but now we are seeing that it's slowly recovering and reaching 60% to the baseline demand. We are worried that this is not only it's a long-lasting impact, because the behavior of people can change for longer than the crisis by reducing the trips, which is something expected, but also by incorporating behaviors for the future. Some of them are good, like reducing the needs for traveling and working from home, or using more sustainable modes like the bike or non-motorized transport or walking. Others are not, like increased use of private cars. We are trying to incentivize the use of more sustainable modes. The other thing that we have seen is that the financial sustainability for the operators is really, really compromised. In Ecuador, we were talking to the financiers, and they were telling us not only that the operators are not renewing fleet, but also that they are compromising the future financial capacity, because they are getting credits for consumption to be able to feed their families or to be able to repay their debts. So this is compromising the future indebtedness capacity for the operators. And the only way I see out of this is helping the sector, either directly helping the operators for fleet renovation, because this will be a huge financial sustainability problem in the future, or helping the financial sector that is right now coping with the losses. And I said I had thought that it will be very difficult to structure a PPP during COVID, because the bank actually have successfully supported a PPP structure in Brazil recently, and the key was mitigating risk. The main risk that COVID is causing is demand risk, so the contract was allocating more demand risk in the public sector by establishing minimum and maximum bands. It worked. We had bidders, and we had contract closure. Then on the third question on BRT capacity, it has been like a very heated debate in the sector for maybe 2 decades in Transmilenio. Somehow there are the modes war, we say, people that prefer metros and people that prefer BRTs. And the reality that we are seeing is that the cities are complex and require different capacities adapted to the density, mainly of the corridors. And what I believe is in HITS, hierarchically integrated transport systems. We need to combine the underground metro, which is by far the biggest capacity mode that we have, with the BRT for areas in which the capacity needs are a little bit less, and with conventional buses when the BRT is not a feasible solution, because the passenger will not like to transfer, or because you have not enough people to justify an exclusive lane. It is true that we are seeing two kind of failures in BRTs. One that I've been discussing during the presentation: most projects are not achieving the desired level of demand. But the other, we see projects dying of success. In the Transmilenio project is overcrowded, but it needs to be complemented by other modes. And this is why Bogota is building the first metro line supported by the World Bank. So I think we should not think one mode or the other. All modes should work together and adapt to the local context. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alejandro, for responding to the question. I received actually several other interesting questions. So let me read those questions and ask you to respond comprehensively as a final remarks. Then we wrap up our seminar. Let me continue reading Tsuboike-san's second and third question. In some countries, governments try to keep the fare low, sometimes too low, to promote the usage or to increase accessibility of the population, and government subsidy is prerequisite for those cases. How do you see the feasibility or sustainability of this trend? Do you see any good model of cost recovery or good balance of public and private in order to secure the sustainability of the public finance? Land value capture can be a solution, but it requires a long-term investment. And then she continued asking another question. In Colombia, there are cases of integrated urban transport operations fare system of e-modal, BRT, Metro, and LRT, etc., managed by the agencies such as Metro Plus, Medellin. How do you evaluate this kind of institutional arrangement? And then we received a comment from the Professor Yoshino, Keio University. Thank you very much for Yoshino-sensei. If infrastructure relies only on user charges, bankable project will not be so high. Users prefer low fees and private investors prefer high rate of return. Infrastructure structure creates spillover effect into the region. New businesses will start and new housing will be constructed. Property tax, income tax, corporate tax will rise. All these taxes were collected by the government without return to the private sector, private investors in infrastructure. In part, spillover tax revenues were returned to the private investors. They received not only user fees, but also spillover tax revenues will make many projects be imbankable. So that's a comment from Yoshino-sensei. And lastly, quite interesting question we just received. I would like to know what needs to be considered when applying to Asian cities, taking into account the differences with Latin American cities in terms of legal, financial, or infrastructures. So this is the last question from Yuki-san. So I would like to ask Alejandro to come in and then make sort of a comprehensive final remarks, and we wrap up the session. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I may, Koichi, I will combine question first. The government's trying to keep the fair law and how this affect the project feasibility. And question 3, the users that they relying on users or users first, it's a constraint for achieving bankability, and that the investment in infrastructure will have a spillovers that will increase the income taxes. So first thing, my way of seeing the structuring the financial structure of the project, and many people will disagree with me, is completely the linking or completely separating the setting the user fees with the how do we pay the project. I think for setting the user fees, we should apply a policy that has to take into account what are the benefits of the project, how many people will be attracting this fare to the system, and also how can we take care of the most vulnerable. And several elements on this. The first one, demand subsidies. You don't need to keep the overall fare low. You just need to guarantee that nobody is excluded from the system. If you are able to identify the most vulnerable system, then you can apply the subsidy to the people that needs it. And then the fare revenue is not so severely affected. Second element, make the government responsible for their decisions. Sometimes keeping the fare low is not a need from a policy perspective, from a transport policy perspective. It's more like a political decision. I don't want to increase the fare, even if it is affordable, because the opposition will criticize it. Well, if you make this kind of decision, then you have to ensure that the financial sustainability of the project will not be affected. And I discussed in the beginning the possibility of providing partial guarantees. Also, another possibility is retaining some demand risk or having demand bans. So if the revenue is not enough, then you can pay the operator, you can pay or repay the bank loans. And finally, how do we pay for urban transport projects? Land value capture mechanisms and other alternative sources of funding, those are great, but as I said, they are limited. I think the best way for paying for these kind of projects is having the support from the national government. And the professor said that the income taxes will be increased by the project, but who is collecting income taxes? This is the national government. Most cities are responsible for paying for public transport services, but there is a fiscal disequilibrium. The national government is in a better position to collect taxes. Then the national government should be providing transfers for the cities and the subnational government to be able to pay for their services. Traditionally, there is like a conception that like subsidizing the operation is very dangerous and we should focus on paying for infrastructure and services. I think we should do as they do in Europe and in the United States, and they don't do that in Latin America. Well, in some countries, not in all. We should consider what is the technical fare of the project and the link that from the fare that we apply to the users and establish a subsidy and structure the subsidy in the most efficient way, targeting the most vulnerable people. So this will be my answer to questions first and third. The role of the national government is key. The alternative source of funding should be used, but they are limited, and they also should be used in a way that incentivize better behaviors, like parking fees, congestion charges are also like disincentivizing the use of less sustainable modes. Now, Colombia, integrated urban transport fare system in Medellin. This is a great example of integration in the region. The metro is managing the fare collection system, the Tarjeta SIVA, if I recall correctly, and the BRT, which is publicly operated, is also using this system. And the government, through this business collaboration agreement I was mentioning before, they managed to incorporate the same fare collection system into the private operators of traditional buses. Now private operators will pay for the metro for the operation of the fare collection system. Something that they did for the implementation that I really like too is that usually there is a huge problem when expanding the fare collection system to less dense areas, because when you have a mass transit system, you have many people concentrated in special points like the transfer stations, and it is quite easy to get the cards distributed. But when you start expanding to less dense areas and to the conventional bus system, usually it's more difficult to get a recharge network for people to recharge their cards and to buy their cards. What they had in Medellin is the possibility of paying with cash without losing the information. Because fare collection systems have like two benefits. The first one is that we don't need to handle so much cash with all the associated risk. The second one is the information we get from the fare collection system on the demand. So people will go to the bus, will pay with cash if they don't have the card available, and then the driver will tap with the special card. So we still are measuring the demand levels in the system. And the fourth question, how this applies to Asian cities. This book is relying a lot on Latin American experiences. We have 12 cases that we are analyzing in the appendix, and I think only one or two are from Asia. But the intention of the book, as I said, is not to provide a specific advice. Is to provide a method, is to provide a framework. So my answer will be that you should provide this answer. Just analyze any system using the risk matrix, using the methodology depicted in the book, and you should be able to be by asking very specific, answering very specific questions on who should do what are the main risks of the project, how should we manage that, and doing the stakeholder analysis, then the answer will show up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for responding to all the questions that we received from the audience. This evening, we had the pleasure of having Alejandro Hoyos Guerrero, Senior Transport Specialist in the Transportation Global Practice of the World Bank. Alejandro, thank you very much for being with us this evening from Spain. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, Koichi. See you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Next
week, we are featuring the latest report, Employment in Crisis, the Path to Better Jobs in Post-COVID-19 Latin America. And our future speaker will be Joanna Silva, Senior Economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean. This will start at 8 a.m. on Friday, August 6th in Japan Standard Time. Once again, thank you very much for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next week. Thank you very much.